When I came home after 12 days on a bridge repair job, there were 200 strangers drinking champagne in my backyard, a bride standing in my vegetable garden, and a woman in pearls telling me I was trespassing on my own property. I had dust on my boots, a duffel bag in one hand, and absolutely no idea why a string quartet was playing beside my tool shed. Then the HOA president pointed toward the street and said, "Walter, leave now before you ruin the photographs." And that was the moment I knew somebody had made a mistake so enormous that anger would only spoil the fun. I smiled, accepted a crab cake from a confused waiter, and looked past the white tents toward my old equipment barn. Because 28 years in commercial construction had taught me something important. When a structure is rotten from the foundation, you do not argue with the paint. You tear the whole thing apart. But to understand how a wedding ended up behind my house, I need to take you back 3 months to when I first moved into Oak Hollow Preserve. My name is Walter Pike. I am 61 years old, recently retired from construction management, and I inherited the house from my Aunt Ruth after my wife, June, passed away. June had fought ovarian cancer for nearly 2 years, and, by the end of it, hospitals had become more familiar to me than home. After she was gone, my daughter Erin kept telling me I needed a place with trees, quiet mornings, and enough work to keep my hands busy. So Ruth's old farmhouse seemed like the answer. It sat on 2.5 acres at the edge of Oak Hollow, a polished Indiana subdivision built around land that used to belong to dairy farmers. Most of the newer homes were squeezed onto neat little quarter-acre lots, but Ruth's property had been there since 1948, long before the stone entrance signs, decorative ponds, and matching mailboxes. The house was plain but solid, with oak floors, a wide back porch, 2 enormous maple trees, and a garden that had somehow survived years of neglect. June and I had renewed our vows beneath one of those trees 15 years earlier, so the place carried memories in every direction. Some mornings, I would stand on the porch holding Ruth's chipped coffee mug, listening to the wind move through the leaves, and feel like June might walk through the screen door at any second. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that reminded me I had loved somebody deeply, and I'd preferred that to feeling nothing. My peace lasted 9 days. On the 10th morning, I was replacing rotted boards on the porch when I heard heels striking the driveway with the confidence of a judge entering a courtroom. Cynthia Marlowe came walking toward me in cream-colored slacks, oversized sunglasses, and a silk scarf that probably cost more than my table saw. Cynthia was 54, president of the Oak Hollow Residential Council, married to the nephew of the original developer, and known around the neighborhood as the woman who could turn a bird feeder into a constitutional crisis. She held a clipboard against her chest and gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Pike," she said, "we need to discuss your compliance failures." I looked around at my empty yard. My what? She handed me 3 pages of violations. The mailbox was not an approved model. The garden fence was 4 inches too high. The gravel turnaround exceeded current width limits. The shed was painted an unauthorized shade of green, and the porch light had visible brass hardware. "Visible brass hardware," I repeated. Cynthia nodded as if I had confessed to armed robbery. Community appearance depends on consistency. The fines totaled $380 per week until everything was corrected. I told her every item on that list had existed before Oak Hollow had an HOA. She replied that older structures only remained exempt if the owner had filed preservation paperwork after the covenanters were amended in 2020. Aunt Ruth had been 87 in 2020 and could barely operate her television remote, much less monitor covenant amendments. Cynthia tilted her head and said, "Rules do not disappear because someone chooses not to understand them." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was clever, but because of how much she enjoyed saying it. Over the next 2 weeks, the fines multiplied. Cynthia returned with 2 members of what she called the Architectural Harmony Committee, both carrying cameras and measuring tapes. They photographed my deck posts, my rain barrel, the wheels on my utility trailer, and a small wooden sign June had painted that said, "Grow through what you go through." Cynthia called it unauthorized decorative messaging. By the time they finished, I had 19 violations and weekly penalties of more than $1,600. She gave me 30 days to comply, then casually mentioned liens and forced sale proceedings. That was when I stopped seeing her as an annoying neighbor and started seeing her as a project problem. Construction teaches you to measure before you cut, so I took my tape, camera, and notebook around Oak Hollow, Cynthia's cousin had the same green shed. Her treasurer had a taller fence than mine. 3 board members had brass porch fixtures, and Cynthia herself had a hot tub sitting nearly 2 feet inside the required setback. None had citations. The only people receiving fines were the 5 families who owned the original large parcels. Older homes, bigger yards, aging owners. Exactly the kind of properties a developer would want consolidated. I created a spreadsheet with photographs, measurements, addresses, and covenant references, then sent it to the county planning office. 4 days later, an inspector named Luis Mendoza arrived in a Mud Street pickup. Luis had spent 32 years enforcing property codes and possessed the calm expression of a man who had heard every lie available in English. He inspected my property, walked the neighborhood, reviewed my spreadsheet, and finally closed his notebook. "Mr. Pike," he said, "this is selective enforcement so obvious it borders on performance art. The county suspended every recent HOA citation pending review, and Cynthia received official notices for her own setback and electrical violations. I thought that might teach her caution. Instead, it taught her hatred." Her brother, Adrian Marlowe, showed up in a Navy suit carrying a legal letter accusing me of harassment, defamation, and interference with association business. He warned that fighting the HOA could cost more than my property was worth. After he left, Erin read the letter over the phone and laughed so hard she had to put me on speaker. "Dad," she said, "this is intimidation written by somebody who charges by the adjective." Then her voice changed. "Why are they spending this much money over an old shed?" That question sent me to the county records office, where I found 2 things Cynthia never expected me to see. First, Oak Hollow had paid Adrian's law firm nearly $70,000 in 18 months without competitive bids. Second, my property was not legally inside the association boundary at all. An error in the original subdivision survey placed Ruth's parcel under county jurisdiction, outside Oak Hollow's recorded covenant map. For decades, the association had collected dues and issued threats on land it did not control. I hired a retired surveyor named Frank Delaney, who confirmed the boundary with original field notes and iron markers buried beneath 40 years of soil. When I demanded proof of authority, Adrian did not provide it. He filed an emergency motion accusing me of abusing technicalities. That was the moment I knew they were scared. Cynthia could no longer find me, so she began turning the neighborhood against me. My trash collection was skipped. Packages disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving, and conversations went quiet whenever I approached. At the next HOA meeting, she stood before 40 residents and described me as a threat to property values, community harmony, and Oak Hollow's reputation as a premier private event venue. Event venue. Those 2 words landed differently than everything else she said. I looked up from my notes and saw Cynthia watching me, just for half a second, before she quickly turned away. I had spent my whole career recognizing the sound a structure makes before it fails, and right then, sitting in that overheated community room while my neighbors stared at me like I was the enemy, I heard the first crack. The next morning, I searched every public event permit issued inside Oak Hollow over the previous 2 years, and what I found made the fines, the legal threats, and Cynthia's little neighborhood smear campaign suddenly fit together like pieces from the same ugly puzzle. The association had applied for 16 special event permits, including anniversary dinners, corporate retreats, charity galas, and 9 wedding receptions, all described as private community gatherings held on exclusive residential grounds. Every application listed Cynthia Marlowe as the event coordinator. Erin came over that evening with her laptop and a sack of takeout sandwiches, and within an hour she found a company called Marlowe Garden Experiences, registered 18 months earlier using Cynthia's home address. The website had been taken down, but Erin pulled up an archived version, and there, beneath phrases like timeless country elegance and private estate charm, were photographs of my backyard. Not a yard that looked like mine. My actual yard. My maple trees, Ruth's stone fire pit, the old barn doors I had restored, even June's hand-painted garden sign, cropped just carefully enough that nobody could read the words. I stared at the screen and felt something colder than anger settle in my chest. Cynthia had photographed my property during her inspections, then used those pictures to sell strangers an experience she did not own. Erin clicked through the gallery and whispered, "Dad, she has pricing packages." The largest one was called the Heritage Estate Collection. Up to 200 guests, full lawn access, bridal preparation rooms, parking coordination, and exclusive use of the private gardens. The price started at $14,000. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Apparently, my grief came with a weekend rental rate. Frank Delaney joined us the next day and brought copies of old aerial surveys showing that Cynthia had no legal access route, utility easement, or shared use rights anywhere on my parcel. We also found an insurance filing that listed my address as an approved event location, which meant Cynthia had not only advertised my property, she had represented to insurers that she controlled it. Frank leaned back in my kitchen chair, rubbed his gray beard, and said, "Walter, either this woman is the dumbest criminal in Indiana, or she's gotten away with it so long that she thinks paperwork belongs to whoever wears the nicest shoes." The answer arrived at 7 the following morning when a nervous young man in a catering polo knocked on my door holding a clipboard. His name was Noah Briggs, 19 years old, and he said his company was scheduled to begin setup for the Caldwell and Reeves wedding that Saturday. 200 guests, full dinner service, live band, champagne tower, and a ceremony beneath the North Maple. He said it casually, like he was confirming a delivery window. I asked him to show me the address. He turned the clipboard around, and there it was, my house, renamed Pike Manor Gardens, and a contract worth $16,500. Noah's face lost all its color when I told him I owned the property and had never approved a wedding. He looked toward the barn, then back at the contract, and said, "But the rental company dropped off chairs yesterday." I walked him around the side of the house, and sure enough, behind a row of lilacs, somebody had stacked nearly 200 white folding chairs where I could not see them from the driveway. There were also bundles of tent poles, decorative arches, and electrical cables hidden under tarps. Cynthia had been preparing my yard while I was away, helping an old contractor finish an emergency bridge project. She knew my schedule because the HOA had required residents to submit absence notices for neighborhood security. She had turned a safety form into a booking calendar. I invited Noah inside, gave him coffee, and called his supervisor on speaker. The supervisor started defensive, insisting they had a valid agreement with Marlowe Garden Experiences. But when I read the property deed number and explained the boundary dispute, his tone changed fast. He admitted they had serviced 4 previous events connected to Cynthia, though most had been held on properties belonging to elderly residents who were traveling or receiving medical care. That detail hit me hard. Cynthia was not just using my yard because it was beautiful. She had built her business around people she believed would be too old, too isolated, or too frightened to fight back. Noah then mentioned 3 additional bookings at my address over the next 6 weeks, worth nearly $48,000. Aaron recorded his statement with permission, photographed the contracts, and contacted the Caldwell family's attorney. By noon, the bride's mother was crying. The bride's father was threatening criminal charges, and Cynthia was leaving me voicemails demanding that I stop confusing her vendors. Her third message was my favorite. "Walter," she said, "you need to understand that these arrangements benefit the entire community. Your refusal to cooperate is selfish and financially damaging." I called her back and asked one question. "How much of the $16,500 were you planning to give me?" Silence. Then she said, "This property has always functioned as part of Oak Hollow's shared visual landscape." Shared visual landscape. That was a new one. I told her my truck was also visible from the road, but that did not mean she could rent it for prom night. She hung up. At that point, Aaron wanted me to call the sheriff immediately, but I had spent enough years supervising difficult jobs to know the difference between stopping a problem and documenting the whole failure. If we canceled everything quietly, Cynthia would claim a misunderstanding, refund part of the money, destroy records, and let Adrian bury the rest in legal fog. What we needed was a clear picture of her operation happening in real time, with witnesses who had no connection to me. So I called Mason Cole, an old friend who had run excavation and emergency site work for 20 years. Mason listened without interrupting, then gave a low whistle. "You were telling me somebody built a wedding business in your backyard while fining you for a brass porch light? That is what I am telling you." He laughed so hard I had to move the phone away from my ear. Mason still held county contracts for emergency drainage, septic evaluation, and removal of unsafe structures. After reviewing the permits, he explained that hosting repeated commercial gatherings without approved sanitation capacity created legitimate health concerns. 200 guests, catering staff, portable kitchens, generators, and temporary plumbing could not simply be dropped onto residential land without inspection. Frank also discovered something else. Cynthia had installed permanent steel tent anchors beneath the grass, poured 2 narrow concrete equipment pads behind the barn, and run an unpermitted gas line to a makeshift outdoor serving station. I had mistaken the covered station for leftover farm equipment because it was hidden behind old fencing. Cynthia had not merely advertised my property. She had physically altered it. Once the county building office saw the photographs, they scheduled an emergency inspection for Saturday morning. The health department agreed to inspect the septic and food service setup, while the fire marshal wanted to examine the generators, fuel storage, and temporary electrical wiring. None of them cared about my feud with Cynthia. They cared that somebody had created an unlicensed commercial venue with no occupancy plan, no emergency access map and no owner authorization. Aaron contacted a local consumer reporter named Dana Klein, who had spent years investigating contractor scams and fraudulent wedding vendors. Dana did not promise coverage until she verified the documents, but after speaking with Noah, the Caldwell family, and 2 former clients, she called back and said, "Mr. Pike, this is not a neighborhood dispute. This is a business selling access to stolen property." She planned to bring a camera crew Saturday morning. By Friday afternoon, the operation was lined up with the kind of precision I once used for hospital demolitions. Mason's crew would arrive at 6 to secure the unsafe installations. County inspectors would arrive at 7. The health department and fire marshal would follow. Dana's crew would be there before the vendors. The sheriff had copies of the deed, survey, contracts, and insurance documents. I installed motion cameras around the property, not because I expected trouble, but because Cynthia had taught me never to underestimate the confidence of a person who had confused influence with immunity. At 11:16 that night, the camera alert woke me. 3 figures were moving behind the barn. The first wore a dark coat, a scarf over her hair, and shoes completely unsuited for sneaking across wet grass. Even in infrared, I recognized Cynthia. 2 younger men followed her, carrying a plastic jug and a tool bag. They approached Mason's excavator and tried to open the fuel compartment, then pulled at hydraulic lines with a pair of household pliers. One of them whispered that they should leave. Cynthia snapped, "If this equipment fails inspection, the wedding proceeds and Walter gets arrested for interference." I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, watching her create evidence against herself, one clumsy decision at a time. Part of me wanted to march outside and confront her, but another part remembered every elderly homeowner she had frightened, every check she had collected, and every lie she had delivered with that polished smile. So I stayed still, saved the footage to 3 separate locations, and called the sheriff. They told me not to approach. Cynthia left 15 minutes later, believing she had sabotaged the machine. What she had actually done was give us recorded proof of trespassing, attempted vandalism, and intent to obstruct an official inspection. At 5:30 the next morning, a deputy arrived carrying a temporary court order signed just before midnight by a judge who happened to belong to Cynthia's country club. The order prohibited me from interfering with lawful commercial activity conducted under existing contracts. The deputy read it twice, then looked past me toward the equipment and said, "Mr. Pike, I have a feeling this morning is about to become complicated." I handed him the deed, Noah's contract, the survey, and a tablet showing Cynthia crouched beside the excavator with a plastic jug in her hand. His expression changed slowly. Then all at once, he stepped back toward his cruiser and reached for the radio just as Mason's first diesel truck turned into the driveway. County inspectors behind him, and dawn began spreading across the same lawn where, in less than 4 hours, 200 wedding guests expected to watch a bride walk down an aisle Cynthia had built on stolen ground. By 6:15, Mason had his crew gathered beside the barn. The deputy had called in a supervisor, and the temporary court order was already starting to collapse under the weight of the evidence Cynthia had conveniently recorded against herself. The excavator had not been damaged badly enough to stop working, but Mason found sugar scattered around the fuel cap and tool marks on the hydraulic housing, which gave the fire marshal another legitimate reason to secure the area. At 7, Luis Mendoza arrived with 2 county inspectors, followed by the health department and a woman from the state consumer protection office. Cynthia showed up 10 minutes later in a white luxury SUV, wearing pearls, a pale blue suit, and the expression of someone arriving to accept an award. Adrian climbed out behind her with a leather briefcase and started waving the court order before his shoes had even touched the gravel. "This inspection stops now," he announced. "My client has valid contracts and judicial protection against interference." The deputy looked at him, then pointed toward the tablet displaying Cynthia beside the excavator. "You might want to choose your next sentence carefully, counselor." For the first time since I had met him, Adrian looked uncertain. Cynthia did not. She marched straight toward me and lowered her voice. "Walter, you have already done enough damage. Let the wedding happen, and we can discuss compensation later." "Compensation for what?" I asked. "Renting my land? Installing gas lines behind my barn? Or trying to sabotage county equipment?" Her eyes flicked toward the cameras mounted under the eaves, and I watched the confidence drain out of her face, one shade at a time. Before she could answer, Dana Klein's news van rolled into the driveway. Cynthia straightened instantly, smiled for the camera, and tried to transform herself from trespasser into community leader. "This is a private neighborhood matter," she said. "Mr. Pike is using government agencies to harass a respected local business." Dana held up a copy of the wedding contract. "Is this respected business selling access to property it does not own?" Cynthia's smile tightened. "The property is historically integrated into Oak Hollow's shared community plan." Frank Delaney stepped forward carrying the original survey map and said, "That is a beautiful sentence, but it is not a legal boundary." He planted 2 survey flags along the edge of the concrete serving pad and showed the camera that every permanent structure Cynthia had installed sat inside my parcel. Not near it, not partly across it, fully inside it. The health inspector opened the serving station and found an unapproved propane manifold, food waste draining into a shallow gravel trench, and temporary plumbing connected to an outdoor faucet without a backflow preventer. The fire marshal found extension cables buried beneath mulch and fuel cans stored beside the generator enclosure. Lewis inspected the concrete pads and steel anchors, then issued an emergency removal order for unpermitted commercial structures, creating an immediate public safety risk. Adrian protested so loudly that birds scattered from the maple trees. "You cannot destroy improvements covered by active contracts," he shouted. Luis handed him the order and said, "Improvements require permission from the owner. These are encroachments." At 8:40, the florist arrived, followed by a rental truck, the string quartet, 2 bartenders, and a baker carrying a 6-tier cake with sugar flowers. Each vendor stopped at the entrance and stared at the excavator, the inspectors, and the television camera. Then the first guests began arriving, men in dark suits, women in bright summer dresses, elderly relatives leaning on canes, children holding gift bags, all stepping into what looked less like a wedding venue and more like the scene of a federal raid. The bride's parents arrived in a black sedan, and the father came toward me with his jaw clenched so tightly I expected a tooth to crack. He had every reason to be angry, but when I showed him the deed and the photographs of Cynthia installing structures without permission, his anger changed direction. "We gave her $16,500, he said quietly. "She told us your house was the historic caretaker residence, and the lawn belonged to the association." Behind him, the bride stood beside the car in her dress, staring at the maple tree where she had planned to take her vows. I walked over and told her the truth as gently as I could. None of this was her fault. She looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes and said, "I just wanted one good day." That sentence hit harder than anything Cynthia had done to me. For a moment, I saw June in a hospital bed asking me to stop worrying and sit beside her, and I remembered how quickly a person's plans can be taken away. I told the bride I was sorry, but allowing 200 people into an unsafe, fraudulent venue would put all of them at risk and give Cynthia another chance to escape responsibility. She nodded, wiped her face, and said, "Then make sure everyone knows what she did." Mason started the excavator at 9 sharp. The diesel engine rolled across the yard like distant thunder, and Cynthia finally lost control. She ran toward the machine, shouting that we were destroying her investment. Dana followed with the camera rolling. "Your investment," she repeated. "Did you just admit these structures belong to you?" Cynthia froze, but it was too late. Mason lowered the bucket onto the first concrete pad, and the sound of it cracking carried through the crowd. He tore out the hidden tent anchors one by one, pulling them from the soil like rusted teeth. The serving station came next, its illegal gas lines disconnected by the fire marshal before Mason folded the metal frame into itself. Then he reached for the white wooden ceremony arch Cynthia had bolted beside the maple tree. The machine lifted it carefully, almost gently, and for one strange second it hung in the morning light. flowers still wrapped around the lattice. Before Mason dropped it onto the rubble pile, Cynthia screamed, "You cannot do this to me." I looked at her and said, "That is the problem, Cynthia. You still think this is being done to you." The deputy stepped forward with another officer and told her to place her hands behind her back. She was arrested for attempted equipment sabotage, criminal trespass, fraud, and obstruction, while Adrian was ordered to surrender documents connected to the business and HOA accounts. 3 months later, Cynthia faced charges tied to 11 fraudulent events, dozens of forged property authorizations, insurance misrepresentations, and more than $200,000 in payments. Adrian's license was suspended while investigators reviewed the association's legal spending. The old HOA dissolved, and the residents formed a simple neighborhood council with open books, public votes, and no authority over private property. Frank became president after insisting he did not want the job, which was exactly why everyone trusted him with it. The bride and groom rescheduled their ceremony for the fall, and this time they asked me directly. I let them use the yard for free after the county cleared the property. And when they stood beneath that maple tree, there were no hidden contracts, no cameras waiting for a scandal, and no woman in pearls pretending she owned the horizon. Still, people around Oak Hollow argued about what I had done. Some said I should have stopped the wedding quietly and spared the family the humiliation. Others said letting the fraud unfold publicly was the only way to expose everyone involved. I still think about that sometimes, especially when the wind moves through June's old chimes and the yard goes quiet again. So tell me honestly, if someone stole your property, sold it to strangers, and hid behind community power, would you protect the innocent guests and settle it privately? Or would you let the whole rotten structure come down where everyone could see it? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me who was right, who went too far, and whether justice is still justice when it arrives with a diesel engine.